Welcome to the Functional Herbal Medicine Podcast. We are your hosts, Kristin and David. We have collaborated to discuss a functional approach to herbs and healing and to share practical tools that you can use in your everyday life to become your own best healer. Today's topic is all about the Hpa axis. We will talk about exactly what that is, how it becomes dysregulated, and what that actually looks like. And lastly, we'll share practical things that you can start doing today to bring your Hpa axis back into balance for better energy, mood, immune system, and hormonal balance. Okay, so Hpa axis, what exactly is it? So there is couple areas in the brain that control this. We've got the hypothalamus, we've got the pituitary, and then those two systems connect to the adrenals. And this is kind of like your stress regulation system. So it's the thing that gets you up in the morning. It helps you to actually have energy throughout your day. And it also regulates your sleep-wake cycle. So when to be awake, when to be asleep and calm, and then also kicking it into high gear when we need it to be.
I kind of like how you introduce the HPA. Like, what is it? Because I don't think most of science knows what it is. It's so complex that it's like we probably barely scratched the surface with all of the science we have. And then you and I today, we're going to do just a brief overview.
Totally. And it'll be we're not really going to be able to get into all of the nitty gritty in a 45 to an hour minute podcast, because the system is so vast and it covers so many different systems and organs in the body, just because our hypothalamus is one of those master organs that it's kind of like the puppeteer in your brain. So it's like the top level thing that controls all of the downstream systems. So it's almost like your temperature control in your body, but not only for temperature. It's kind of like it's there and it's constantly monitoring what is going on in your system so that it can influence other things to maintain homeostasis in the body.
Yeah, there's an aspect of the hypothalamus that's actually outside the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier separates the brain from the rest of the body ultimately because, let's take glucose, for example. Glucose is highly reactive and it can oxidize. If there's too much glucose in the body, that's where we start seeing cardiovascular disease. We see, I think they're called AGEs, which stands for advanced glycosylated end product. And it's a weird type of sugar molecule that just goes around and does damage to our vascular system. So yeah, there's a part of the hypothalamus that's actually outside the blood-brain barrier because it needs to regulate what's cycling through the blood. So that's where it picks up glucose, picks up all of our hormones and our stress response to know what it needs to upregulate, what it needs to downregulate. How it downregulates is through what they call a positive feedback loop. And yeah, so it ultimately changes the body to read the blood.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So let's focus on the HPA specifically, because there's all these different systems that the hypothalamus really communicates with. Hypothalamus tends to communicate with pituitary, which will communicate with all of our endocrine glands. So that's not just the adrenals, it's also the thyroid and the reproductive glands. So kind of big picture stuff, when this system gets dysregulated, it will affect all of these downstream things. So it will affect the thyroid and it will affect the reproductive glands. So we can see already how this is a really wide and varied system. But if we look just at the adrenal, the HPA an adrenal focus. We have the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary, which communicates with the adrenal glands, of course. And these are little glands that are above the kidneys that secrete our stress hormones. So probably a lot of people are already familiar with the adrenal glands and what they do, but often we're given this idea of like adrenal fatigue, and that's what Hpa axis dysfunction is. But like, let's shift the language, because our adrenals don't actually get fatigued and tired. Like, they're not worn out and that's why you're tired. It's really about this like total Hpa axis dysfunction and the way that it's communicating in the body. So exactly like David said, it's these positive and negative feedback loops that end up regulating this whole system. So when we start to secrete cortisol, stress hormones from the adrenals, it will communicate with the hypothalamus to actually stop that system. So it's kind of like we've got this automatic brake in the body. When all things are regulated well, your body will closely regulate the amount of stress hormones in the body and actually like stop the production and stop the signaling to the adrenals when it becomes too much, or when it becomes to the point where you're like, okay, I've got what I need.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's a snowballing effect when it comes to chronic fatigue. We have a client at the shop that has been diagnosed with Graves' disease, which is a hyperthyroid condition. So the thyroid is way high. And then she recently went to an endocrinologist and comes to find out that she might have Addison's disease, which is more of like an adrenal burnout described condition. It can be on the back end of like steroid therapy. However, in certain situations, when these hormones get out of balance, you can have Addison's disease. She later found out that Addison's disease was on a threshold and it wasn't completed. But there's the connection with the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands.
Addison disease is a good one to note, because I feel like when you go to like an endocrinologist, like this is really the language that they have when they go through medical school. They're not necessarily taught about like these functional illnesses where you're like don't really have a full-on diagnosis and you're kind of like maybe on your way to one, but you're sort of in this way where you're still functional, but you are like, obviously something's not quite right. And often people kind of go to the endocrinologist and hear these like really big diagnoses, because that's really what they're trained in. Like they're taught about the big extremes of endocrinology, whether that is, so Addison's disease, which is kind of the very far end of the spectrum on the adrenal insufficiency side, so like low cortisol, and then we have like Cushing's disease, which is like the total opposite spectrum of like really super high cortisol, and like that system's constantly activated. So, and what we're talking about is not really the opposite end of the spectrums there. It's like we're talking about all the stuff in the middle that you can kind of still go about your life and do your things, but something isn't quite right. And that's really what we mean by like a Hpa axis dysfunction. It's this middle space where your energy, your mood, your hormones, your even immune system and blood sugar levels, that's all just a little bit off, but you're not really full on into your those diagnoses. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, the term that you might hear if you go to the doctor or when you come into like a naturopath clinic is subclinical. Because if you went to a doctor and said, oh, I have adrenal burnout, my adrenal glands aren't working, they'll run the blood work and be like, no, your adrenal glands are fine. However, you aren't feeling well, like Kristin was saying. So what we tend to see more subclinical type diagnoses at the dispensary, because people either they self-diagnose by going on Google, or they go to a doctor, they know something's kind of off, but however, there's not much they can offer them. You know, what can a doctor offer if somebody's got adrenal fatigue? Like back in the day, they might have given them stimulants, actually. That was a common drug back in, the early 1900s, that they would just give stimulants, like, oh, take stimulants. We obviously know how impactful that is on the body over a long period of time. Nowadays, what are they going to offer? They might send you out, say, change your diet and lifestyle a little bit, and that's where they meet us.
Totally. Cool. So we have this kind of big overview about what it is, and hopefully by now people are kind of getting a little bit of a grasp on like the far reaches that this system affects. And I just want to say, like, we're talking a lot about stress here today. And like in acute situations, stress is great. We actually need that. We need cortisol. We need to be able to respond to things and, be able to take care of stuff, or be able to actually run away or, fight if that situation were to come up. So cortisol and the stress response is a healthy thing, and we absolutely need it. Where it becomes problematic is where it's like this chronic stress response and the HPA axis gets dysregulated. So we'll talk about what that actually looks like in a second. But it's kind of like we need this short amount of stress, but we also need to be able to like come back from that and resettle down into our body and like come out of the fight or flight. So when we get stuck into these chronic stress spaces, then that's when we start to see all these systems start to break down. Because when you flip into your stress response, it's like, your physiology actually shifts in order to respond to whatever is coming at you. So this system was made, or it was evolved when we were like running from tigers, and maybe not us, but we were running from bears here. And so it's like, you see a threat, you recognize a threat, and you be able to run away, and your body will do things like, okay, well, let's shut down all our long-term plans. Like, we don't really need to be digesting breakfast. We don't really need to be focusing on reproduction. Ultimately, what we need is blood flow to the arms and legs so that we can run away or move, and blood flow to different areas of the brain. So, like we have our prefrontal cortex, that's often like what we're on our day-to-day. That is our higher human brain that allows us to kind of function and think and make logical decisions. But when we're stressed out, our body will start focusing on different areas of the brain that actually drive the stress response. And over time, those areas of the brain actually get larger and more active. And then you become more tuned into this like ability to become overly stressed out or like hyper reactive towards stressors. So essentially the goal is not to like get rid of the cortisol and get rid of all of our stress, but essentially it is to be able to manage that stress response. So it's really an acute thing versus a chronic thing.
Definitely. I mean, I know we'll get into the solution-based, but I agree with you. Managing, it's a perception-based response too. So one thing somebody might see stressful, another person wouldn't find stressful. But that prolonged stress is how this world is structured, technically, because like you said, there's no bears chasing after us anymore. We've kind of scared them back into the mountains a little bit. But now it's kind of like this thing, this invisible thing that's scaring us constantly. And everybody has a different response. Everybody has a different thing that's scaring them. But yeah, it's the adrenal glands that are constantly stimulated, plus all the other stimulant things out there.
Mm-hmm, totally. So what's it start to look like when it's chronic and it becomes kind of thrown off? I would say there's like two kind of directions it can go in, this sort of like overactive picture and an underactive picture. But yeah, what do you see in people when they come into the clinic, David?
Yeah, it can be both extremes. So it could be the fatigue, the decreased resiliency to stress. Then it can also be almost like the manic side of it. So you'll have the fatigue, but then you'll have people that can't sleep either. So they have insomnia. And so that's the extremes. Both can be the result of Hpa axis and chronic stress. Salt cravings I see with specific clients. Coffee, caffeine, that's a big one. And that's almost part of the problem too, right? Like it's a cascading effect. You need coffee to keep going, but then coffee crashes you and then you need more coffee. What about you? What have you seen in clinic with patients and how they present to you?
Totally. So I would say like my first clue that says look at HPA axis is the like either chronic fatigue or some level of like their cortisol curve dysfunction. So whether that is they're waking up in the morning and they're still dead tired. So they like really struggling to get out of bed. That tells me that their cortisol isn't rising in the morning. And then fluctuations in energy throughout the day. So that could be like the person that says, after lunch, I always need a nap. So that points to also some blood sugar dysregulation. But, you know, this is also like fluctuations in the cortisol curve. And especially the person that says, oh, I'm a night owl, you know, like there's actually very few true night owls in this world. And so if you are somebody who like just cannot get to bed at night and you're like up until like 3 in the morning and it's just sort of like that's your normal schedule, hate to say it, but you probably have some HPA axis dysfunction. And so there's like some level of like the cortisol curve that is not quite exactly where we want it. And that can look so like a normal cortisol curve. Let's say what that looks like. So it's lowest when you're sleeping, of course. That's what allows us to sleep. And then it starts to rise somewhere in the early hours of the morning. So like maybe 4 a.m.-ish, you start getting a rise in your cortisol curve. And then at some point, it's high enough that it actually gets you up out of bed. That should continue rising throughout your day. And then at some point, you know, when you reach your kind of like starting to wind down, that cortisol curve will start to fall so that you can start settling into bedtime routines and getting back into sleep. So when we don't have this really smooth cortisol curve, that is, first of all, that's like my number one, like this person needs some support in their HPA axis. And then I would say like, you know, symptoms that encompass some of the other things. So when you're a little bit further progressed, that will start looking like digestive issues and it will start looking like hormonal issues. Because as you're, like I said earlier, like as your cortisol is pumping, you are not focused on reproduction. Your body is not like, yeah, let's create babies. Like, it's like, no, let's save our lives and run away from whatever is going on, right? Like, let's manage this situation right now. And you know, once you get into a safe space, all that actually comes back together pretty nicely. But those are big hints. Like, so when people start getting these other things that are going on, and the blood sugar dysregulation is a big one, and that is reflected in the energy levels throughout the day. So, like we said earlier, like this is, you know, the list of symptoms is super long because this system actually affects pretty much everything. But yeah, those are my top my top things that I look for when I think HPA axis dysfunction.
Definitely. I would say one of the maybe early markers that I would see is blood sugar dysregulation. And it doesn't appear in the extreme forms of somebody like diabetes, for example. But blood sugar is quite abruptly disrupted by excess cortisol, as cortisol actually causes the body to be like, hey, we need to alter how we're working with this glucose in our blood. We need to make sure we have enough of it for the organs that eat it. So blood sugar is always instantaneously influenced when we have cortisol. So you'll start seeing those patterns, and we mentioned earlier the afternoon crash, or, you know, the energy levels, the fatigue. So blood sugar is definitely a big one. And that would be, you know, we don't talk a lot about the HPP axis. I mean, I don't even know if that would be a term, but, you know, we go into the gonads, we talk about the reproductive organs, we talk about the thyroid, but the pancreas is an endocrine gland as well. It doesn't just release enzymes, it also is hormonally influenced with insulin. So that's usually a really good sign when blood sugar goes off.
And blood sugar is an interesting one too, because it can, like, stress can drive blood sugar dysregulation, and blood sugar dysregulation can drive stress.
Yeah.
So you can totally get
That's a good
in
point.
this vicious cycle, right? So like we said earlier, physiology changes when you're in this stress state. It's actually a catabolic state, so your body's breaking down muscles, and then all that energy has to go somewhere, and which kind of translates to chronically high, so chronically elevated blood sugar. And cortisol and blood sugar have this relationship where, like, the increase in cortisol actually causes this release of blood sugar. So we can totally get into these cycles where you're just like driving the insulin resistance, and actually it will essentially drive adrenal resistance, because all the glands or all the organs and all the tissues that are getting these inputs start going, okay, this is here all the time, like, we're not going to listen to those inputs anymore. So you start getting insulin resistance, and you start getting that adrenal resistance where your adrenals no longer respond to the cortisol in your body. So that's where that kind of low end of the chronic fatigue and like quote unquote adrenal fatigue looks like, even though we're not really using that term.
You touched on this a little bit earlier about changing definitions or language around these things, and something that's over time actually changed for me is how I view health and wellness and life in general, and it's looking at it through a cyclical pattern. We're talking about, in a sense, we're talking about the impact of cycles of blood sugar and cortisol, and these cycles can be bad in a sense. But by changing the way we view how the body operates will help us to change the pattern. So most of my life, at least, it was a linear type perspective, like you're born, you live, you die kind of perspective. It was like, oh, this happened now, so do something next to prevent the next thing from happening. And by going from linear to cyclical, I can see how I can adjust these patterns and almost predict that these patterns will repeat themselves, so that I'm more prepared to respond differently. And that's kind of the holistic model, I think, is where we tend to want to make small changes over time versus big abrupt changes, because they're lasting, they're lifestyle changes. And then to take Kristin's quote where she shared with one of our detox programs, big doors swing on small hinges.
So little actions do the biggest amount of, or kind of serve you the best, really. They do a lot of work over a long period of time. So let's talk about like the main thing. So I know we've gotten into like what it is and kind of how it shows up. Let's talk about like the main things that tend to dysregulate it. So obviously we know chronic stress. That's kind of like the big picture stuff. But what about like the daily habits, the things people are doing that is that's messing up their HPA axis? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, too much media, maybe too much social media. That's a common one, because I think we're all immersed in that with the way of the world. One way or another, people will tune out of one media and go into another media. And social media is, in a sense, it just influences us the same way. I mean, we can look at it on multiple layers when it comes to technology, that it's the things that we hear that can cause us to have a stress response, or the things we see. But it's also the blue light that we're looking at is activating us. It's stimulating in itself. The fluorescent lights in our houses, and even the technology. Now we're talking about LED lights. Those are things that are popping up everywhere, and those things are more intense than fluorescent lights. And I can feel that in my body even more than fluorescent if I look at it too long. So yeah, I mean, so to get back to the technology and the media, it's not just what we hear; it's also what we're looking at. And then it's kind of what we put ourselves through. This would be more of the perspective side of things. So not all stress has to be perceived as a negative thing. It can be it can be used for growth. And I know we've talked about this before here at the shop, but when babies are born, they come into this world with a stress response. And it doesn't have to be the under the lights with the masked doctor and the cold table and the hard wiping cloth. Like that obviously would cause a stress response for a newborn baby coming out of the womb. However, even if we have these beautiful home births, free births, as I've been calling them lately, even in those moments, the baby's born to cold sensations. The skin is now cold because it came out of the womb. The lungs are sensitive, now breathing in air for the first time. And studies show that there's a stress response there. So not all stress is bad. There is good stress. It's helpful. It helps us grow. So we can change our perception in the sense of each time we have a stressful event, it can be helpful. And then we can also learn from it to not continue to put ourselves in those situations to have another stress response.
Definitely. So I heard two really main themes that you brought up there. So one is perceived stress. And I think this is really super important because we all experience stress differently. So if you're driving down the road and you hit traffic, you're going to experience that differently than the guy next to you. Some people let it really stress themselves out and it's this really intense experience, where some people are happy to just throw on a podcast or throw on some music, throw on this podcast and just chill on your way to work. So it's really about the way you perceive it and less about the stuff that's going on, the actual stuff that's going on in your life, right? So when I see clients and I ask them what are your stress levels like, it's often met with they don't even know how to recognize how much their stress levels are because they're not so much in tune with how it makes them feel. So, they might feel I go to work and my boss yells at me, but I can handle it really well and whatever. That might be okay for you and it might really not be okay, right? So it's really about the way that you perceive things. And the really cool thing about that is the power is in your hands, right? So, easier said than done. I will definitely preface this with saying that, but essentially the power is in your hands to decide what you're going to take on and what you're not going to take on. So, the traffic situation, traffic example is a great example, which is you could sit there in the car and essentially let your blood boil, right? You could let that really stress you out, or you can try and shift your perspective on it and calm yourself down and figure out what it is that you need in that moment to make all these things okay, right? So, it's essentially really bringing back that personal responsibility and what can you do in order to shift your perception on the things that really stress you out and get your cortisol pumping, right? So that was number one. I think that's really super important. And then the other thing you mentioned, David, was the blue light stuff. So that is circadian rhythm. This matches our cortisol curve, right? So when we're watching our TVs and our laptops and our phones at night, we are getting so much stimulation from that blue light, and our bodies are programmed to think blue light is morning light because that's what we naturally get outside. So when you're seeing blue light in the night, it actually messes with your melatonin production, which will mess with your sleep, of course, which actually messes with your brain detoxification. So our brain does our detoxing at night. And if we are not producing enough melatonin is not just a sleepy hormone, it's also a detoxifier. It's an antioxidant. So we can keep going. There's this whole downstream effect, but it's it messes up your sleep, messes up your detoxification, creates sleepiness the next day, which creates, blood sugar dysregulation and a lack of ability to deal with stress. And of course, brain fog and mood and whatever, when we don't get good sleep, the next day is kind of shot. So just paying attention to the light and the media that we consume, exactly and how that will affect your stress levels throughout the day. And okay, not just the blue light at night, but if you're consuming news or social media that activates you at night, like you're not necessarily setting yourself up for success for sleep or the next day, right? So those two pieces of like, yeah, like how are you perceiving stuff? And then this actual flow of like, are you able to like live like a human? Or are we kind of these robots, right? Are we these work robots that are stuck to our computers? Hopefully not. That's not how I want to live my life. So like, can we actually learn how to be human and like fluctuate with the light cycles? And that will ultimately help bring down inflammation, bring down stress levels, and help you to regulate the HPA axis, which is, you know, kind of like we said, the puppeteer that really has all these downstream effects throughout the whole body.
And, you know, if somebody listening to this, if you are the type of person Kristin kind of brought up, which is like, they can't recognize their stress levels, almost kind of like desensitized to stress levels. One real easy way to do this is just to go out into nature. Go out into nature, separate yourself from the concrete jungle that's all around us. Because how unless you're really tuning into your body, how would you know the impact of the stress, our environment around us? Because everything around us is stimulating and stressful inside this concrete jungle. It's almost like it's designed consciously or unconsciously to be this way. That you have the loud garbage truck going down the street. You have the sirens every 30 minutes these days. You have the fluorescent lights. All these things that are around us that are just constantly activating us one way or another, unconsciously quite often. So go out to nature, and it's almost like an elimination diet of the stressful things, right? We talk about elimination diets with food and pulling out the bad things, and then you reintroduce the bad things. And that's how you're like, oh, I can feel that. But go out into nature, ground, notice how your energy shifts and how you feel, and then go back in the concrete jungle and see what you feel. And that's one easy way to gauge it, because we're meant to be more with plants and with animals and with running water and sunshine on our backs. Everything else is, you know, I use this term a lot, but I kind of mean it. It's a synthetic form of reality. You know, these structures we live in, the lights we use, the air that we're circulating with air conditioning and heating, it's a synthetic form of our natural environment.
Mm-hmm. Totally agreed. And yeah, that comes down to like that living like a human, like go out and like live like a human would have, right? And that's like, those are essentially the foundations to good health. Good water, good food, like sunshine, get outside, enjoy nature, like find some joy out there, you know? Those are the things that help bring all of this back into harmony. Okay, so let's look at like what are some things that people can do? So I mean, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but like what are some really super simple tips that people can do right now to start regulating themselves and start like bringing this back into balance?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that popped in my head is like take herbs. I mean, just because I know how powerful they are. But, you know, one step beyond that, and I think it's a missing component in all of the West, and I've seen it leaving the West and going to other places around the world, is a sense of like ritual or a practice that is to connect back to the divine. And you can do that with herbs, right? You can do herbal teas, and the act and the process of making tea is a ritual. You know, a tincture, less so, you know, you pour it in a little dosage cup, you drink it. That's less ritualistic, but ritual is one helpful tip that I've been able to suggest to other people, and that's helped change my life, is to make a pattern or routine. You know, even if it's like a nice cup of chamomile tea, or, you know, skullcap and chamomile are probably my two favorite together for stress response. I
would say like my top tips here would be like all of the things that we've already touched on. So like finding a rhythm in your life, you know, get waking up at the same time, sleeping at the same time, eat at regular times. And this is like essentially just like support your circadian rhythm so that you are getting on the right cortisol curve and your body's getting the right signals at the right time. And so that is like, you know, finding a rhythm in your day, and then also with your food, balancing your blood sugar. So I would say like, I don't know, that can get into a funny territory because a lot of people will go like, oh, balance your blood sugar, meaning like don't eat any carbs. I maybe was in that camp once upon a time, but like I now totally believe that you can have carbs and have really well balanced blood sugar. And it's really just about like the way that you eat your foods and kind of the way that you, like the way you pair things together and the way that you approach your meals actually. So, you know, eating whole foods and then pairing whatever carbs you do eat, even if it's dessert, like pair that with an actual meal, proteins, fats, and fiber. And that will help to increase satiety and like keep your energy levels stable throughout the day. And essentially what we're avoiding when we do that is like these insulin spikes and drops that are caused by simple carbs and sugars and stress. These like when we're having multiple of those throughout the day, we're massively increasing our stress response. So by just like focusing on our blood sugar balance, we can get a lot closer to that smooth cortisol curve and not like necessarily be pressing that cortisol button all the time. Because every time your insulin levels drop, you're starting to secrete cortisol to get the energy back up and actually secrete any stored blood sugar. So that is like, I would say like my big two, finding your rhythm and blood sugar balance. Managing perceived stress, that can look like a lot of different things. And then I would say like find your appropriate like level of movement. So, maybe it's not going to the gym and lifting weights, but maybe it is just starting with walks after each meal. That will help with blood sugar balance, but it also kind of get your body moving and help you to like release any of your like, your stress that you hold in your body.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to add into movement yoga. I do yoga quite often. I recommend yoga for a lot of people because it's a gentle movement. And then you have like yin and yang type yogas that one's more movement based, one's more relaxation based. Because like you said, going to the gym and lifting hardcore weights, it might help dispel stress of the mind, but it's putting stress on the body. And in a sense, you're kind of sacrificing one to benefit the other, where something like a yin yoga can actually just slow things down, allow you to become more present. Once we become present in the current moment, we quite often remember how we quite often move to that state of gratitude when we're in the present moment, because we're in the future, we're kind of anxiety. When we're in the past, we're reflecting on things that we could have done better. When we move into that present moment with something like yoga or walking, like Kristin said, these things help to just remind us of the good things.
Definitely. And one more thing I wanted to add in, we're going to get into some helpful herbs in a second, but one final thing I wanted to add in. So this will totally contribute to some level of Hpa Axis dysfunction and something that we can address in order to support. It is kind of examining what your like toxin exposure is and your like overall general health. So what I mean by that is if you are like in a very polluted environment, so you're not getting clean water, you're not getting clean food, maybe you live in a moldy house, you're consuming pesticides from your food, all these things create a stressful environment in the body because you're polluting it with all sorts of things that shouldn't necessarily be there. Now that's like pretty difficult to avoid entirely in this world. But definitely, creating mindful choices in terms of like getting the cleanest things possible, whether that's food, water, or like even like cleaning products and laundry detergents and like the sort of like the cosmetic things that a lot of women use, like, considering what is in those, because it does have some level of impact on the way that our body can function. And essentially, if like anything that we are doing that makes it harder for our body to stay in homeostasis will cause some level of stress. So all these kind of toxicants, or if you have some level of chronic infection, which is, again, kind of usually a sign of a toxicant. But if you have these things going on, then you're going to have a harder time regulating your HPA axis with all the lifestyle stuff is great and it will definitely be helpful, but there's definitely this piece there that we have to address. It's like, if you aren't feeding yourself well and you're not drinking good water and you're surrounded by pollutants all of the time, you're gonna have that constant stress on the body. So that's where like working with a practitioner is super helpful. We can help you create this plan where like we can examine all of the lifestyle stuff and all of the environmental stuff and what's going on and help you create a plan. So one thing I wanted to ask you, David, is like, what are your thoughts on like succession? So when somebody comes in and they have adrenal fatigue, or they have insomnia and all, like blood sugar dysregulation, like is HPA Axis a good place to start?
Yeah, I mean, based off of what you said with the consultation piece, this is the benefit to working directly with a practitioner, because everybody's is going to be different where we start. In the functional herbal protocol in air quotes, we have 12 strategies that we would go through, and it depends, kind of like what you talked about earlier, that stress can influence blood sugar and throw it off, or blood sugar can throw off stress. So HPA, custom formulas, we can kind of address blood sugar regulation while supporting the stress response. And stress, almost, if we're doing a daily tonic for somebody, stress is almost always addressed. Somebody will come in and they'll be like, oh, I have eczema. And so I kind of tell them the options. I suggest maybe a cream and a tincture internally, a daily tonic. And they're thinking like, okay, well, give me the stuff that's going to help with the immune system. Give me stuff that's going to help clear out the eczema itself and liver support. And then they don't even think about like nervous system support or like adaptogens, which I think we'll touch on here shortly. Mm-hmm. These things will influence the eczema. So we do address the HPA axis, some more so than others. On the adrenal burnout, the whole formula might be focused around supporting the adrenal glands, supporting stress response. But quite often, almost all of our formulas have some sort of like nervine or adaptogen in them that's going to help with stress overall.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree entirely with all of that. So, I mean, you can't necessarily say that definitively it is a good place or not good place to start, because it is super, super individual, case by case basis. That's kind of how we work. So, if you're listening to this thinking like, oh, maybe you need some support in that way. Regardless of where you are, the lifestyle stuff we've suggested is going to be supportive for you. That's a really awesome place to start for you on your own as you kind of start on your healing journey. And then herbals can look like a lot of things. So we're definitely going to get into a little bit about adaptogens, and it can and I would say like when we work with people, we're kind of like assessing what is like, one, what is the root cause? Like, what is really the thing that is driving this? And then also, what are like the big things that really, really need to be supported right now in order to facilitate greater healing down the road? So the HPA axis is definitely a big part of that, because when we are chronically stressed, we're not in our like rest and repair state. So like you're not building tissues, you're not really nourishing your body because you're not digesting well, and you're breaking down tissues when you're in a chronically stressed out state. So definitely needing to get into a calmer state, but then it might look also like supporting the gut so that you actually can eat the foods and then get the nourishment and absorption out of those foods, right? Because we can eat stuff and it can essentially go straight through us. So if you're listening to this and you're like, where do I start? Definitely like lifestyle stuff is the best place to start. And then working with a practitioner in order to figure out like what your herbal strategies would be. Because often we start in one place and then move to access different levels of your condition.
Definitely. The herbal medicine world has expanded and grown so much, even just the last, 4 years that I've been practicing. But as an example, you can go to the grocery store and look on the shelf, and there'll be like a stress sleep formula. And I recently picked up one of these products the other day. We were out of town, and I needed something in the short term. And this formula had like 7 different herbs, and all of these herbs are phenomenal plants. Like, we use them all for stress and sleep. But the way the formula is built is just kind of like stabbing at every different level of it. They're working with the anxiolytics and the nervines, and then they're using these strong sedatives. And it was helpful. I knew how to dose it properly. I knew I needed to increase the dose to get the effects that we needed in the moment. However, these types of formulas quite often fall short of providing solutions for people, especially if you're trying to take a holistic approach to this, which is what Kristin's talking about. You need to address the whole picture. So not just throwing another product at something to try to get relief. You have to address the underlying cause. So if it is the social media, taking steps to remove that. And to go back to the eczema component, that can be stress influenced. If we just throw herbs at trying to get rid of the eczema, but not address the underlying effect, which is, let's say, stress, then we're kind of throwing a cup of water on a big bonfire. We're going to have a little bit of that fire's put out, but the fire is just going to quickly take back over again. So getting to the underlying cause is the holistic approach. It is the functional medicine approach to find solutions, long-term solutions. Kristin has shared a few good stories with me on how one client of hers was actually like chronically ill, if you will. And by doing diet adjustments over time, the person was able to like go back and, enjoy some of the beautiful things in life. Cookies are amazing, and they offer joy and happiness, which is its whole own component of releasing dopamine and those pleasure response neurotransmitters. But, cookies every single day, it's going to increase stress.
Definitely. Moderation and like time and place, right? So that's a perfect example. Like, this person had to do an pretty strict elimination diet for a while, worked with herbals, gut healing, got them to a better place so that when we introduce foods again, it's it's actually tolerable. Maybe not to have every single meal or every single day, but being able to go out to a restaurant was quite novel for this person. So it's kind of when we address the right things at the right time, then we can really get somebody to be able to really live their normal life, which is, that's totally the goal. So let's just talk quickly about some really key herbals that we use. I'm going to preface this by saying I don't necessarily encourage people to hear this and then go out to their supermarket or their Whole Foods or their health food store and just get a single herb. They often work synergistically really well together. And like we've just been mentioning, when you have a set plan, that's really where the herbals are able to offer a lot of benefit. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone go out and get these generic blends or whatever. And then they're like, oh, herbs don't work. And it's well, no, those herbs didn't work for you because of the exact situation and the formulation and whatever. So this information isn't necessarily so you can go and self-treat yourself. It's really about education, so that it's out there, and if there's something that resonates with you, and you can get in contact with one of us or another herbalist that you trust, or whatever suits you. But finding the right herbs that work for you with somebody that can really tailor your plan to you so that it is the most effective potential thing it could be. So that being said, what are your favorite adrenal herbs, David?
Oh, adrenal support. I mean, we have the borage and Rehmannias. Those are the ones we would actually use for adrenal burnout. Those are very specific to the adrenal glands. But just the overall stress response, skullcap is probably it's easy. I have so many favorite herbs. It's hard to gauge them on my top 3 or top 5 because it's they'll cycle up and then they'll come back down and they'll reemerge in the top 3. But skullcap is almost always on the top as it's a calming sedative. It's slightly cooling. So for my constitution specifically, this is why I love it so much. and I've worked with it so much, and I recommend it so much. It's kind of cooling. So I have a hot constitution. This is an energetic thing. Maybe Chris and I will do a whole podcast on just like energetics and how our bodies interact with plants. But yeah, skullcap, it's also antispasmodic, so it kind of relaxes. I'm also a constricted tissue state, which means, my body is tense, my muscles are tense. I'm more prone to something like high blood pressure, for example, because my vascular system will be more constricted. So this plant just kind of relaxes. It's sedative. It tastes good. It has a slight bitterness to it. And then it also falls in the category of neurotropho-restorative. That's a posh term that we use at the dispensary. All that really means is it helps restore the nervous system. It's a tonic to the nervous system. That long-term use of skullcap will actually will offset that stress response. If somebody, this will be an example of somebody that's like in that stress response all the time, and I use the image of a cup. So with a cup, there'll be, we'll have our stress levels. If somebody, half of the cup is full and the stress levels are there, that traffic that Kristin was talking about earlier, it'll add a little bit more stress, but it doesn't overflow. Somebody that's at this high, their stress levels are at the brim of the cup, and then that traffic stall happens, it just overflows the stress and they explode. Skullcap helps to kind of return the nervous system back to that place where it can be like, oh, that little stressful thing happened, I can respond this way, and it restores the nervous system. I love it. Chat with an herbalist, get skullcap. It's a phenomenal plant. It grows like a weed. It's in the Lamaceae plant family. That's the mint plant family. So once you get it in the ground, this thing will just spread everywhere. I have lemon balm everywhere. It's in the same plant family. So yeah, skullcap. What about you, Kristin?
Definitely. Skullcap is such a good one for like that, like overactive brain chatter. I love it. I would say, I'm a really big fan of the adrenal gland restorative. So like, the borage and the Romania. I'm a super big fan of Romania. It's a yin tonic. So if you're like this, like wired and tired type person. So if you, like you kind of always have this like anxious type energy about you, but you're also fatigued. Romania is such a good plant for that because it adds this like, it adds, I'm going to say it adds like fluids to the body. It kind of adds this like juiciness and like it really is, it helps to kind of counteract this like dry, tired, fatigued kind of thing. It's just like really super supportive. And then I would say like some of the adaptogens like withania, or that's the Latin name, ashwagandha, because it's super gentle. So if you haven't heard the term adaptogens, it's kind of in the name, helps you adapt to stress, although these things can be used at the wrong time. So like, some of them are stimulating, so you could technically use them to push through a situation where you're fatigued, but ultimately that doesn't necessarily serve you over the long run. So something like ashwagandha that's not actually stimulating helps to regulate the circadian rhythm, which of course now we know is a big part of the Hpa Axis function. And that's pretty well tolerated by a lot of people. It addresses like the thyroid level as well. So those are really awesome, a couple of awesome adaptogens.
Definitely. Ashwagandha, it's kind of like the term that came to my mind when you were speaking about it is like the gentle giant, because it is, it's gentle that you can use it with kids and it's very relaxing and grounding, but you can do pretty high doses of ashwagandha. Again, talk with a herbalist. But you can do pretty high doses of it, and it has this building aspect where it actually, weightlifters use it to build muscle. It's anabolic, it's building. And so I love ashwagandha. I cycle on and off of my adaptogens. So, everything from ashwagandha to reishi mushroom. What's the newest one that I've been kind of experimenting with? A little bit of Siberian ginseng. That one's a little too stimulating for me, but ashwagandha and reishi are probably the two that I just go back and forth with because they're so supportive for me.
Totally. And the cool thing about all of these is like they all have their little niche, right? So like ashwagandha, if someone has thyroid dysfunction along with their HPA axis dysfunction, that's an amazing herb for them. If they have allergies and like histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome, reishi is amazing. It's got these like anti-allergic properties. If you have blood sugar dysregulation, actually a lot of these will help blood sugar, but like holy basil has got to be one of my favorites for somebody who's like stressed out, has blood sugar dysregulation. So that's a really cool part. There's like so many options, and but they all have their little niche that they seem to fit into. So again, that kind of highlights the like this kind of custom herbal formulas where we like can really match the right herb to your particular situation, and you know, again, holistic, right? So looking at all of the things that are going in on the body, and like how can we support that in these specific ways with the right herbs. And then I guess the only other thing that is worth considering in here, so David, you mentioned the nervines. These help to kind of like calm the nervous system. We also have these other terms called anxiolytics, so they help bring down anxiety. Thymoleptics help to improve the mood and uplift you. And then you can also use what we would call antispasmodics or spasmolytics, which help to relax the body. And this was similar to what David was saying with like that constricted tissue state. So relaxing the actual musculature can sometimes trick the brain into saying, oh, we're safe and we're calm. So we can use like all these in a formula to help support kind of these different levels of really helping the body to feel more calm and be able to manage the stress response a little bit better. And I would say the last thing to add in is rest. Okay. This is a big deal. So if you have HPA axis dysfunction, if you're stressed out, blood sugar dysregulation, hormonal imbalances, all these things, you need to consider honoring rest. So obviously that is a part of the sleep-wake cycles, but like, you know, don't necessarily just push through stressful and fatigued situations because you can, right? Like we can use stimulating herbs to get you up and out, but that's really only suitable in very particular situations. So you can essentially cause greater issues and greater burnout by forcing your body to be able to just push through certain situations. So if your body is telling you that it's tired, it's time to listen to that and figure out ways you can honor your rest state. So, you know, setting boundaries around your time and the people that you share your energy with, and, you know, taking whatever time you need to rest, relax, and like let your body feel calm and safe.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, that would be the Yin Yang balance in the traditional Chinese medicine energetics. You know, we live in a world of Yang. I mean, we have the economy that's always supposed to always grow. We have the work schedule, you name it, the lights, everything that is the society is built around is just Yang, stimulating energy, moving energy, and it's good. You know, there's nothing bad about it. It's just that we need to make time for the balance of the Yin. You know, go inward, go slow, relax. And it's a re-remembering that we need to come back to, that, you know, maybe we're the generation or the generation after us, who knows, that are going to really be able to embrace that slow and inward aspect, where we're kind of we're in the stage of remembering it as we're becoming adults now. So,
and like, it's a really great reminder that it's a balance, right? So, you know, if you can think of like the circular yin yang symbol, there's half and half, a large side that's yin, a large side that's yang, and then there's these little circles. So the yin within the yang and the yang within the yin. And so it's really about finding this harmonious balance that suits you, and that helps you really like live your life in a joyful and free way. I think that's ultimately the goal of like just being able to enjoy your life and feel healthy and like go out there and enjoy a hike, or like, play the sports, or, I don't know, whatever it is that you like to do, right? So like having the energy and resilience to be able to take on the fun things in life and the things that we really love to do. Because often I think that's the thing that gets put to the side, right? It's like we wake up, we go to work, we do our 9 to 5s, Monday to Friday, and then we're exhausted outside of those hours. And so you come home, you watch TV, and that's it. Or you work Monday to Friday, and then you like, I don't know, whatever you do on the weekend, but like, you may not actually spend the time doing the things that actually make you feel joyful and excited about life. So, that's that's all part of rest. So honoring like honoring the yang and honoring the yin and finding a way to like bring it all together so that you can enjoy your life. So I think that's a good place to wrap up for the day. What do you think, David?
Yeah, perfect. Beautiful.
Okay, cool. So that is what we've got for you today. That is our podcast all on HPA Axis. If you liked this podcast, please do share it with somebody who might find it interesting or needs to hear this information. And of course, if you'd like to work more closely with us, we both offer one-on-one consultations where we discuss your personal story and we go in depth to uncover and address the underlying causes of your illness. So you can connect with us through our websites, our emails, or our social media, which is all linked in the description under this video. And David mentioned it a little bit earlier. I think next time on our podcast, we're going to talk about the energetics of herbal medicine. So I don't know if we have a schedule set for that, and we might kind of filter in some other things along the way, but that will be our planned topic for our next thing together. So do you want to tell them a little bit about what energetics means and what to look forward to?
Yeah. I mean, it's ultimately the tool that practitioners hundreds, thousands of years ago used to diagnose. And as herbalists, we don't diagnose. However, we have ways of doing clinical observation and it's a different language to put the term for people's conditions. So like I'll use blood pressure again. Blood pressure, you can look at how it presents in the body and the vascular system gets tighter and more constricted. So then we would connect that to the constricted tissue state. However, it's not always even behind the constricted tissue state, that can be caused by heat. So somebody that's kind of always on sugar, always on the coffee, always go, stressed out, that would be an excitation state that's kind of influencing the constriction. And then there could be like a damp, stuck type condition where there's excess fluid in the body and that's putting pressure on the vascular system to be tight and closed. So energetics isn't one or all. It's also, it's up to the practitioner too. The practitioner has their eyes on this as well. So we try to pull ourselves out of it. However, each of us have our own clinical expertise and, the patient finds their practitioner. Ultimately, traditional Chinese medicine will have their energetics. This would be the Western model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so it's like a really cool aspect of herbs that is not found in our conventional Western medicine. It's a way that we can really tailor herbs towards your unique body, and kind of like a way to work with conditions that don't necessarily have an official diagnosis, or, maybe in those situations, the diagnosis doesn't actually quite matter so much because it's really more about the presentation of the illness. And then the other side of that is that like each person has their own, you've heard us say constitution. So that is essentially the energetics that are innately within that person. So when we talk about energetics, there's the person's energetics, the condition energetics, and the energetics of herbs. So we can harmonize all of these things together to help bring about balance. So I think there's going to be lots of really cool info in there. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episodes. And thank you for listening. See you next time.
Bye.